I remember looking at that text message, sitting there on the sofa in our small apartment, afternoon sun warming the cinnamon-scented air around me. "We need to talk urgently," it said. And for a split second, a familiar, cold dread gripped my stomach, a ghost of a feeling from a life that felt a million miles away. But then I glanced over at Emily, peacefully asleep beside me, her sketchbook fallen open on her chest, and that cold dread melted into something like quiet triumph. It was a strange, powerful feeling, this profound peace, especially when juxtaposed against the chaos that text represented. I sent my reply, "Another time, I'm on a date with your sister," then turned my phone off. That day, I finally understood the full, bitter picture of my past. But to really get it, to understand how I could get to that moment, calm and content, we have to go back. Way back. My life used to feel like a house of cards, constantly on the verge of collapse. The night Chloe walked out, I just had the worst investor call of my life, the kind where you can practically hear the disappointed sigh before they even say no. I came home expecting to vent, to fall into familiar arms. Instead, the house was silent in a way that just felt wrong, an unnatural quiet. Chloe was in our bedroom, not yelling, not rushing, just methodically folding clothes into a suitcase, like she was packing for a business trip she'd planned weeks ago. I stood in the doorway, watching her, for what felt like an eternity. When she finally looked up, her face held that detached expression I'd seen when she talked about firing someone from her art studio, already decided. "I want a divorce, Alex." The words were so calm, so final, they stripped away any hope that this was an impulsive fight we could fix over coffee. The next morning, I asked her why. What happened? What changed? She stopped folding a sweater to look at me, her eyes conveying that I was genuinely stupid for not understanding. She told me the startup was failing, that I'd been failing for months, that she'd married a man with ambition and potential, not someone who couldn't even secure basic funding in Austin, Texas, in the middle of a tech boom. I reminded her about the student loans I'd paid off for her, $60,000 that took 3 years of my previous salary, and the 2 years I'd financially supported her art studio when it was bleeding money every month, when she'd refused to admit it wasn't working. She looked at me then with something close to pity and said, "I married potential, not failure." That sentence hit me like a physical blow. It meant she'd been evaluating me like an investment this whole time, not loving me like a husband. I asked if there was someone else. She said no. But there was a fractional pause before the word, just half a second too long, and I knew she was lying, even if I couldn't prove it. Looking back now, it was so obvious. The distance for months, coming home late from her studio, vague plans, constantly checking her phone with this guilty look. But I'd been too buried trying to save the company to connect the dots. She finished packing, zipped up the suitcase, and walked past me without a touch, without an apology, without giving any indication that this hurt her, even a little. I heard her car start, the sound fading down the street. And then I was alone in a house that suddenly felt 3 times bigger, and completely empty. I spent that night on the couch, drinking a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving for when we finally got our series of funding, replaying every moment, trying to pinpoint where she stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a liability. Betrayal doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewrites your entire history, makes you question every smile, every kiss, every time she said she believed in me. I remembered how she used to brag about my company at parties, introducing me as a founder and entrepreneur. I realized she wasn't proud of me. She was proud of what I represented to her friends. The next morning, I dragged myself to the office. My marriage was over, but I still had a company to save. I walked in to find Miles, my co-founder, supposedly my best friend since college, sitting at the conference table. His laptop was closed, his hands folded like he was about to deliver bad news at a funeral. He told me he was leaving, that he'd accepted a position at a competitor. It wasn't personal, he said, but he needed stability. He couldn't keep working on something that might not exist in 6 months. I asked him how long he'd been planning this. He admitted he'd been interviewing for over a month. So, he was looking for exits while I was begging investors and burning through my savings to make payroll. He called it a business decision, hoped I'd understand. I wanted to punch him. Instead, I just nodded and told him to take his stuff and go. Within 2 hours, he was gone. I sat in an office that used to have 4 desks and now had one, staring at code I didn't fully understand. Miles was the technical guy, I was the business guy. Without him, I wasn't even sure what I was anymore. I called my lawyer, David, who I'd used for the business incorporation, and told him I needed help with the divorce. He recommended Sarah Vance, a shark who specialized in high-stakes separations and worked on contingency for cases she believed in. Sarah turned out to be exactly what I needed. Cold, strategic, completely uninterested in my feelings, which was perfect because I didn't have the energy to be coddled. She told me Chloe was asking for half the business, half the savings, the house, and one of the cars, basically everything except my laptop and the debt. I told Sarah I'd give up everything except the company. I needed to keep the business, even if it was failing, because it was the only thing I had left that proved I wasn't completely worthless. Sarah made it happen. Somehow, she negotiated a deal where Chloe got the house, the car, and most of the savings, and I got to keep the company and about $15,000 in credit card debt. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later, fast by Florida standards when both parties agreed to terms. I signed the papers in Sarah's office while Chloe signed them remotely. She couldn't even be bothered to show up in person. After that, I was technically homeless. I'd given up the house, and I couldn't afford rent anywhere decent. I lived out of my car for about a week, then started rotating through friends' couches, never staying more than 3 nights in one place. I didn't want to become a burden. The company was barely surviving. I had maybe 2 clients left, paying just enough to cover server costs. I worked 16-hour days trying to build something sustainable out of the wreckage. The technical work was the hardest part. I had to teach myself everything Miles used to handle. Nights were spent watching coding tutorials and reading documentation until my eyes burned. The really complex stuff I outsourced to freelancers on platforms like Upwork, which ate into what little profit I was making. I stopped going to networking events. I couldn't stand the questions about how the business was going, or where Chloe was. And I definitely couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes when they figured out both answers. One night, I was sleeping in my car outside a coffee shop with free Wi-Fi, trying to finish a proposal due the next morning, when I got a text from Emily, Chloe's younger sister. I'd always liked her, but barely knew her. She wrote, "Hey, I heard what happened and I have a couch if you need one. No strings attached." I almost didn't respond. I figured Chloe had sent her to check on me, or report back. But I was exhausted and desperate, and the offer sounded genuine. I texted back, asking if she was sure. She sent me her address with a message, "Come over. I'm making pasta." It was such a normal, human thing to say that I almost cried right there in the parking lot. I drove to her apartment that night with everything I owned in 2 duffel bags and a laptop case. When she opened the door, she didn't hug me, or ask how I was feeling, or do any of the emotional labor I was dreading. She just stepped aside and said, "Couch is yours. Bathroom is down the hall. Dinner in 20 minutes. It was exactly what I needed to hear. Living with Emily felt weird at first. Not because she made it awkward, but because I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. For her to ask me for rent I couldn't pay, or tell me I needed to leave, or worst of all, report back to Chloe about how pathetic I'd become. But none of that happened. After about a week, I realized she genuinely just wanted to help, with no agenda. Her apartment was small, maybe 800 square feet total, with 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a living room that became my bedroom once she cleared off the couch and brought out some spare blankets. The place always smelled like cinnamon because she burned these cheap candles from the dollar store. And there were art supplies everywhere, half-finished paintings leaning against walls, sketchbooks piled on the coffee table, colored pencils scattered across every surface. She was an art teacher at a local high school, which meant she left early and came back around 4. We developed this rhythm where I'd work from her kitchen table during the day, and she'd cook dinner when she got home. Nothing fancy, just pasta or stir-fry, whatever she could make for under $10. We didn't talk much those first few weeks, not because things were tense, but because we were both naturally quiet people. And I appreciated that she never pushed me to open up or process my feelings or do any of that therapy speak stuff that everyone else seemed obsessed with. One night, she came home with groceries and I offered to pay for half. She looked at me like I'd said something ridiculous and told me, "This isn't charity. This is life." I didn't fully understand it until later, when I realized she meant this was just how people were supposed to treat each other, without keeping score or expecting something in return. The company started turning around, slowly, painfully slowly, like watching a plant grow where you can't see any progress day to day, but then you look back a month later and realize something changed. I landed a new client through a cold email I sent at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, some mid-sized company that needed help streamlining their data management. I handled the strategy and client relations while outsourcing the heavy coding to an affordable freelancer I'd found. They paid up front, which meant I could finally buy groceries, contribute to the household, and pay my freelancer on time. Then I landed another client through a referral from the first one, and then another. Suddenly, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something real. Emily would come home and find me still at the kitchen table, laptop open, coffee cup empty, and she'd just sit down across from me and sketch while I worked, not saying anything, just being present in a way that made the apartment feel less empty. We started watching movies together on weekends, stupid action films and old comedies. I realized I was laughing again for the first time in months. Not forced laughter to be polite, but real laughter that came from somewhere genuine. She told me stories about her students, about the kid who only drew dinosaurs, and the girl who was insanely talented but didn't believe it. I told her about the technical challenges I was facing with the company. And somehow these mundane conversations felt more intimate than any deep philosophical talk I'd ever had with Chloe. About 3 months into living there, I noticed things had shifted between us in a way I couldn't quite name. She touched my shoulder when she walked past the kitchen table, just a brief contact that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and I'd find myself looking forward to the sound of her key in the lock at the end of the day. We started cooking together instead of her cooking while I worked. And there was something about standing next to each other, chopping vegetables, arguing about whether garlic should be minced or pressed, that felt more like home than anything I'd experienced in my marriage. One Saturday night, we were sitting on her tiny balcony, barely big enough for 2 chairs, drinking cheap wine and watching the city lights. She asked me what I wanted to do when the company was stable, like, really stable, not just surviving. I told her I wanted to hire a team again, build something that mattered, maybe work on projects that actually help people instead of just making rich companies richer. She nodded and said she wanted to open a community art center someday, somewhere kids could come after school and just create, without worrying about grades or college applications or any of that pressure. We sat there, talking about these impossible dreams like they were actually possible. And at some point, I realized I'd stopped thinking about Chloe entirely. Whole days would go by where she didn't cross my mind even once. The kiss happened on a Thursday night, which I only remember because Emily had just gotten paid and splurged on actual good wine instead of the $7 bottles we usually bought. We were on the couch, watching some documentary about street artists, and she made a comment about how people always underestimate art teachers, assume they're failed artists who settled for a paycheck. I told her that was wrong, that teaching was its own form of creation. She looked at me then with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between surprise and gratitude. And before I could overthink it, I leaned in and kissed her. She kissed me back immediately, no hesitation. When we finally pulled apart, she smiled and said, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." Which made me laugh because apparently I'd been the last one to realize what was happening between us. We talked for hours that night about what this meant, whether it was too soon, whether Chloe would lose her mind, whether we were making a huge mistake. And Emily finally cut through all my anxiety by saying, "I love you, and I'm pretty sure you love me, so can we just start there and figure out the rest later?" I told her I did love her, that I'd probably loved her for weeks without admitting it to myself. She kissed me again and said she'd been waiting to hear that. We kept our relationship quiet at first, not because we were ashamed, but because I wasn't ready for the inevitable confrontation with Chloe, and Emily wasn't ready to deal with the questions and judgment that would come from telling her family. But we were happy, in a way that felt solid and real, not performative or dependent on external validation. Just two people who genuinely enjoyed being around each other. The company hit a major milestone about a month later when I signed a contract with a client that would bring in 6 figures over the next year, enough money that I could finally move out and get my own place. But when I mentioned it to Emily, she looked almost hurt. I realized I didn't want to move out, that this small apartment with its cinnamon candles and art supplies and shared meals had become more of a home than the house I'd given up in the divorce. We decided I'd stay and we'd split rent officially, make it a real partnership instead of me crashing on her couch indefinitely. Things were finally stable, finally good, finally moving in a direction that felt right. And then, one morning, I woke up to that text from Chloe. I stared at it for a solid minute, feeling my stomach drop. And then I looked over at Emily, sleeping next to me, and remembered that Chloe didn't get to dictate my life anymore. I texted back, "Another time, I'm on a date with your sister," and turned off my phone. Emily woke up a few minutes later and asked what I was smiling about. I showed her the message and watched her eyes go wide before she started laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. The next morning, Chloe showed up at Emily's apartment unannounced. She must have gotten the address somehow, probably from mutual friends or by following one of us. I didn't know and didn't really care. I was making coffee in the kitchen when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps that somehow sounded angry. Emily opened the door before I could stop her. Chloe walked in and froze when she saw me standing there in sweatpants and one of Emily's oversized hoodies. The look on her face was something between shock and rage, and something else I couldn't quite identify. She didn't yell or cry or make a scene. She just stood there staring at both of us like we were strangers. Finally, she said she needed to talk to me alone. Emily squeezed my hand and went into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I sat down on the couch and waited for whatever bomb Chloe was about to drop. She sat across from me in the same chair where I'd kissed Emily for the first time. She looked smaller somehow, like the confidence and polish she'd always carried had been stripped away. She told me she'd made a mistake, that leaving me was the worst decision of her life. She admitted she'd been seeing Miles for 4 months before the divorce, and he'd convinced her I was dead weight holding her back. I felt my chest tighten hearing his name, not because I was surprised, but because having it confirmed made the betrayal real in a way it hadn't been before. She said Miles had promised her they'd start a life together once I was out of the picture, that he was making 6 figures at his new job and could give her the stability she wanted. But it all fell apart 3 months after our divorce was finalized. Apparently, he'd been stealing clients from my company the whole time he was working there, taking our proprietary code and pitching it to competitors, building his entire new position on intellectual property he'd helped create but didn't own. Chloe found out because he got sloppy, left emails open on his laptop. When she confronted him about it, he admitted everything and told her it was just business, nothing personal. She said she felt sick realizing she destroyed our marriage for someone who turned out to be worse than anything she'd accused me of being. Now Miles had dumped her because she was asking too many questions about his ethics, and he didn't need the liability. I sat there, listening to all of this, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, or satisfaction, or vindication. Just a kind of hollow exhaustion that came from caring about someone who'd never really cared about you. She asked if there was any chance we could try again, start over, rebuild what we'd lost. I almost laughed, because the audacity of that question after everything she just admitted was genuinely stunning. I told her no. Not because I was trying to punish her, but because I'd moved on in a way that was final and complete. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. She asked if it was because of Emily. I said yes, partly. But also because I'd realized during the divorce that our marriage had been broken long before she left, that we'd been performing happiness instead of actually living it. Chloe started crying then, real tears, not manipulative ones. She said she still loved me and didn't know how to live with what she'd done. I felt bad for her in that moment, genuinely bad, because I understood what it was like to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. But I also knew that her pain wasn't my responsibility anymore. I told her she needed to leave, that Emily and I were happy, and I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into giving up something real for something that had always been conditional. She stood up slowly, wiped her eyes, and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned around and said she hoped I knew what I was doing with her sister. I told her I did, that Emily had loved me through the worst period of my life when Chloe had run away from it, and that made all the difference. She left without saying anything else. I heard her car start outside and knew that was probably the last time I'd ever see her. The situation with Miles got complicated fast because once I knew what he'd done, I couldn't just let it go. I called Sarah Vance and told her everything Chloe had told me. Sarah lit up in that cold, calculating way lawyers do when they sense blood in the water. She asked if I had any proof. I said no, but I knew where to look. Over the next 2 weeks, I pulled every file, every email, every piece of documentation from our company's server history. Sarah brought in a forensic tech specialist who confirmed that Miles had copied our entire codebase 3 days before he quit. We had timestamps showing he'd accessed the files at 2 in the morning when he thought no one would notice. We filed a lawsuit for theft of intellectual property and breach of contract. Miles's new company settled within a month because they didn't want the publicity of a trial, especially once Sarah made it clear we had ironclad evidence and she was prepared to make this as public and embarrassing as possible. The settlement was substantial enough to pay off all my debt and actually hire a small team. Part of the agreement included Miles being terminated and barred from working in the tech industry for 5 years. Sarah told me later that his reputation was destroyed, that word had spread through the industry about what he'd done, and he'd probably never work at that level again. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt tired, like I'd spent so much energy on people who didn't deserve it. The company stabilized after that, not overnight, but gradually, in the way real success usually happens when you're not paying attention to it. I hired 2 developers and a project manager. We moved into an actual office space instead of working from Emily's kitchen table. I started taking on projects that actually interested me instead of just whatever paid the bills. Emily and I moved into a bigger apartment together about 6 months after Chloe's visit, a 2-bedroom with a balcony that actually fit furniture, and a second room Emily converted into a studio. We got engaged on the anniversary of the day I moved into her first apartment, and I proposed with a ring I'd saved up for over 3 months. Nothing fancy, but something that felt right. Emily finally told her parents about us a few weeks before the engagement. While it was awkward at first, they came around once they saw how serious we were and how happy Emily was. The wedding was small, just close friends and Emily's parents, and her students who'd shown up to celebrate. We didn't invite Chloe, because some bridges are better left burnt. I thought about Chloe sometimes, wondered if she'd found whatever she was looking for. But those thoughts came less and less frequently until they barely came at all. Emily asked me once if I regretted anything. I told her the only thing I regretted was not meeting her first, not having those years with her instead of Chloe. But she said everything happened the way it needed to, because otherwise we wouldn't have appreciated what we found. She was probably right about that. And standing there at our small wedding reception, watching her laugh with her students who'd shown up to celebrate, I realized I'd gotten something Chloe had never understood. That real love wasn't about potential or status or what someone could do for you. It was about showing up when things were hard and staying when it would be easier to leave. What parts of your own life, when you look back, have you realized were perfectly imperfect?